Hi everyone, and welcome to Real Life Talks. I'm your host Yvonne Heath, author of the book Love Your Life to Death, and founder of the I Just Showed Up movement. So I am so happy to have my friend, a wonderful person, Trisha Cowie here today. Hello, Trisha.
Hello, Yvonne. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. We are going to have just an important conversation. It will perhaps be an emotional or hard conversation. I won't promise that I won't cry, because that just is something I can't make that promise. But I would love for you to share, well, first of all, what is your career? What do you do? And sure. A little bit about your heritage.
Absolutely. So I'm a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I opened my own law firm 6 years ago. Prior to that, I worked at a strictly First Nations legal services firm. Mm-hmm. And then I'm also a member of Hiawatha First Nation. So the reason I became a lawyer was that desire for social justice. Social justice,
yeah. A very important topic, obviously.
Yes.
And that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about our Indigenous community members. And I know that there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of myths out there. There's a lot of things we hear about. We kind of understand, but we don't really. Mm-hmm. And I'm smart enough to say, I don't know, so I'm going to ask. Yeah. And that's why I'm just going to sit back and I'm going to ask Absolutely. You to share what your knowledge, because it's something you're passionate about.
Absolutely.
So one word we've heard, and I'd like to I want everyone to just say, I don't really know. We've heard the terms residential schools. Mm-hmm. In the past, for our Indigenous community members, what were the residential schools?
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to explain it in two different ways, actually. Mm-hmm. Because one of the ways it's been explained is the way that for decades Canadians believed was happening. And that way is that residential schools were places where Indigenous children went to be educated. Mm-hmm. And to be integrated into Canadian society. That was the myth that was told to Canadians. After the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out, mm-hmm. The way they've described residential schools is very different. And they described it as a cultural genocide. And the meaning behind that being that it was the destruction of the structures and practices of Indigenous peoples. It was deliberate. Mm-hmm. It was a deliberate assimilation policy. And so we know that now to be the truth.
So just backing up, Canadians thought that this was a good thing, a positive thing. This was just about education.
I have heard that a lot. Mm-hmm. Since the Truth and Reconciliation report came out. Mm-hmm. That Trisha, we just didn't know.
Right.
And that's to an extent acceptable with most Canadians. Mm-hmm. I can accept that mm-hmm. truth from them. But there is information that does date back, and there were people in government who were saying, no, look, there's been deaths of these children in these schools. We have a tuberculosis problem. We have, they pinpointed the problems with residential schools, and it fell on deaf ears. Mm-hmm. And so that is something in history that we have to remember, that as Canadians, how we treated our most vulnerable people. Not so that we can feel guilty about it forever.
Right.
But so that we can make the changes that are needed to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And very importantly, to honor the victims of those residential schools.
Absolutely.
And the survivors.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And words that I've heard, abuse. There mm-hmm. was a lot of abuse.
Of every kind.
Of every kind. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is, like, these children were removed from their homes.
And
voluntary
removed is a very gentle term. So
yes.
They literally would go into First Nation communities with buses and the RCMP, and they would load up the buses, and that would be the last time you would see your child. And then there are stories from our survivors who have said that they didn't see their parents for 7 years from the time that they were taken. They were not allowed to have that communication with their parents. It was a complete separation from their culture and their language and everything they knew.
everything they knew, everyone they loved, a life that they were familiar with, into a completely different foreign lifestyle. I've seen pictures of kids in rows of desks and rows of beds where they slept, and I mean, it was no longer a family unit, and they didn't have their community. I can't even go to the place of feeling what that would be like, because I won't stop crying and we won't have a conversation. I mean, that's horrifying. I mean, it is nothing less than horrifying.
It isn't, and that's why the term genocide has been used primarily by Indigenous leadership. I know that word makes Canadians uncomfortable.
Yes.
With their history, as it should.
Well, and that's the thing, we should be uncomfortable and, yes, upset with that. And
even if that's not the word you want to use, it doesn't make it any less horrifying about what happened.
And when you think of, these children in these schools who have gone through this, I mean, I talk about grief a lot, talk about tremendous layers of complex grief, and then they grow up. I can't imagine the confusion, the lack of, just a lack of community, where did they belong after?
And that is something that I know only from reading the news or talking with survivors, that is something, for example, let me give an example here. A parent who had been through the residential school system comes home to the community. Eventually they have their own children, their own family, and those children, they'll recognize, why is mom uncomfortable with affection? You see suffering with addictions issues because of the trauma that was suffered when they were away at residential schools. The ability to be a good parent, you didn't learn that at residential schools. So the consequences of residential schools wasn't just with the people who attended them, but it's intergenerational.
Absolutely.
So it becomes a parenting problem. It becomes a community issue where we are trying to find solutions to a lot of different crises in our communities.
Yes, and these residential schools, we're not talking about a century ago, decades ago. The last residential school closed in
1996.
1996.
Yes.
I mean, that's yesterday. That was not long ago.
Yeah, and even though that last residential school is closed, the new fight for keeping our culture and our languages and our children with their communities and with their families is now with child welfare. So today, that's the new beast, is our children are being taken through the child welfare system, and that has been described as the new residential school system.
Oh my goodness. So please tell me we've made some strides in the right direction. Right. Please, because you're saying that the problems have changed, or it's like it has a different name. It's not residential schools, but the child welfare system is not serving the community well. And what do we need to change, Trisha?
Right.
It's so much.
And that's a big question.
It is a huge question.
And it's not something that we have to reinvent the wheel on. We have so many reports. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, it gives us a path forward for fixing, or not, fixing is the wrong word, for rebuilding,
Guidance.
for rebuilding those relationships with Indigenous communities. We have a path forward, and it's in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And
so
they're big items.
Not everybody. So the Truth and Reconciliation report is?
So there was a commission, and their job was to uncover the truth of residential schools. And that was step one, was learning what are the actual facts, like what happened at these schools. Exactly.
Yes.
Because until we know that, we can't determine what the path forward is going to be.
Right.
So that was what the commission was to do, was to come up with the facts. And they also came up with calls to action. And the calls to action are primarily government-based or organization-based, but they're also not meant to stop there. It is up to every individual in Canada.
Yes.
To help see through reconciliation. And even the calls to action that seem impossible because they're so big, or something that we don't technically even have control over. And the example I'll give is one of them was, one of the calls to action is to secure an apology from the Pope for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools. We don't really have control over an apology from the Pope.
Sure.
But what that call to action did, and what that had Canadians came together for with regard to that call to action, was they got together. Canadians got together in Manitoba. They started a petition to at least make that effort to try and say, can we have an apology?
Yes.
And these were Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples who were assisting in this petition. And that in and of itself, whether they got the apology or not, which they have not, that in and of itself is reconciliation in action. So that is people working together and recognizing the past and trying to build a better future.
Right. Indigenous, non-Indigenous, we can all be allies and voices for change, which is why we're here today, because it's like you said, we don't know what we don't know, but once you've heard, once you've heard these terms, once you have a better understanding, and if you don't have an understanding, you can ask, right? Just ask, the information, we can get information, and every act, every voice, everyone who stands up, if they hear something and they say, you know, that isn't actually correct, or everyone deserves respect and rights, and this is
and that
part of it.
That can be difficult to do sometimes, to stand up and say, no, that's incorrect, because sometimes you just might not know.
Right.
And part of the job, I think, is for each person, when you do hear something negative about First Nation, Métis, or Inuit people, when you do hear something that in a way dehumanizes, you know, us or that this group of people, think about it for a minute and be like, well, wait, that sounds really negative. What's the other side to that story?
Because there's always another side.
Challenge yourself to recognize that negative comment and to take a pause and really think, do I really have any knowledge of this?
That's right.
And should I be commenting on it, or where do I need to find more information?
Ask, don't just go along. And so here's the elephant in the room as we talk about. So I have heard here and there, and I'm one to say I don't know those facts. So the reserves, where the reservations where many of our Indigenous community members live, I've heard, first of all, this is what I've heard, that the conditions are terrible in many of them, and I've heard sometimes that there's misappropriation, misuse of funds, and if I hear people saying that, I say, I don't know the answer to that, and I will not just be a part of the conversation. So I am going to ask, what would you reply to that? Myth, I would say.
Yes, and I would call it a myth as well. If you're trying to say that it's First Nations who are not transparent with their money, the truth of the matter is that they are. They're actually, there's so much accountability for money that goes in and out of First Nation communities that it's almost debilitating to getting work done. Because, and I had read somewhere once that if you calculated it out, it would be one report of accounting every 3 days.
One report of accounting every 3 days?
This is how much reporting a First Nation has to do on money that is on reserve. So there is a large amount of accountability. It's all online. It's all public information. And of course, you know, you can always find that one story of something corrupt that happened.
There's stories everywhere.
Exactly.
Of course.
And my response to that is it's the exception,
Okay.
not the rule.
Right.
And that's really important to remember.
Yes,
'cause
it is.
You can point across the board where something negative or something bad happened.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, we have, when we're working in First Nations, we just want the best for our communities. And we're all working together. We all know each other very well. We're all family in one way or another.
We're all connected.
Exactly.
We are all connected. And I truly believe that anyone who is marginalized in our communities, they're important parts of our community, and they have no less worth, value than you, than me, than you. Everyone has value and everyone matters. And I believe that we are all each other's responsibility. Whatever happened in the past, I can't say, oh, well, we didn't create these things. We didn't create residential schools. No, but it is a part of history. It is a hard part of our history. And what can we do to make it better? And so for going back, the Truth and Reconciliation, that was only in 2015 was when that was.
The report was
4 years
released.
ago.
It was only 4 years ago.
And that's today, that's now, and the truth is just coming out.
And as an example for the uphill battle that we have, because this is the job. Yes, we know this happened in the past, but now we have a responsibility. We know this happened, and we know there are things we can do to make it better.
Yes.
And when we have, for example, one of the calls to action was to have a national day in honor of the survivors. I know there was a lot of backlash on that call to action.
Why?
There was some.
Why?
There was some. I know, and
Why?
Some of it was not wanting to take another day off of work. We don't need another national holiday. This will be bad for small business. And there is this idea of, it's time to get over it and move on.
There you go, and that's the elephant in the room, and that's disturbing, actually.
It's very disturbing because we wouldn't say that to, for example, a veteran. It's time to move on from World War II.
If it happened to me in our family, would we say it's time to move on?
No, we needed, and it's so important to honor the story of the people who were at residential schools, survived it, and we can't forget because we can't allow it to happen again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's time for change. It was time for change a long time ago, but it's time for change. And I know so many people, we are compassionate people, but I know often we think, well, what can I do? I don't have money to give, I don't have time to give, but every act of kindness or every time you are not part of an uninformed conversation, or we can all do something, but as community members, what can we do to take action?
And that's a wonderful question because there's something for everyone. And a lot of outreach in the last 4 years since the report came out was, wow, what can I do? And Trisha, do you think this is a good idea? And some of the best ideas have been just hosting an explanation of what is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What did they do? What were the calls to action? So there were a number of churches that reached out and asked me to be a guest speaker.
Wonderful.
And to talk about the importance of that of the report. Another example on a smaller scale, a book club. I had one woman reach out and say, I wanted to start a book club with Indigenous authors only, and that's a wonderful idea. It's you're promoting Indigenous culture, you're assisting Indigenous authors. So there is something that everybody can do, even on that level. It just promotes understanding and empathy as well.
Absolutely. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. And I think I'll have to have you come to Muskoka. I'm just saying, I would like to host an event. And again, asking the questions, right? Asking.
It's so important.
It's so important. And that it's incredible in all the work that I have been doing over the last several years, the acknowledging what has happened and allowing the grief, right? There's big grief in this. There's tremendous, complicated grief. And instead of just saying it's too big a problem to no, what can we do? Because every small step in the right direction is a step towards a better place for all of us.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
There's one other, first of all, two things. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. I've heard this, we've heard this. Is this something that, yes, speak to that, what is that?
Not, again, so something that, not a thing of the past. This is happening now.
Now,
and so missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are facing physical violence and destruction at an absolutely alarming rate. Our women and girls have gone missing. They've been murdered, and there has been, it's been cast aside up until a certain point. And we recently, another commission put together to address the crisis that we have in Canada, to say we have to recognize we have a problem. This is it's a targeted group. It's a targeted group, and we need to care for our most vulnerable. And so we had the commission, again, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission, and they've come out with a report. And they have called it, unlike the residential school report, which they said was a cultural genocide, they actually use just the word genocide in this, because it's the physical destruction of a targeted group. And that's what's happening in Canada to our women and girls. And that's heavy. That's a lot for us to...
There are no words, right? There are no words. And again, it's having these conversations, awareness, and being a voice. If you see something, if you say something, and reach out, and I mean, that's just...
And when organizations are trying to make progress on the calls to action that are in these reports, instead of being the naysayer and, oh, that's not going to work, we need the people who are pushing it. We need the people who are saying, what can I do to contribute? How can we make this happen? What petition do I need to sign? What policy ideas do you need? We need people in these organizations on board. So whether it's a police force, whether it's the provincial government or the federal government or the First Nations government, or if it's a domestic violence organization locally, because they have so much information that can be helpful into changing the way that these cases are actually dealt with, and we need to utilize it.
Oh my goodness, yes, this is a very hard conversation, and we're also ironically having this conversation today, which is September 10th, and this is World Suicide Prevention Day. And I know that suicide among our Indigenous community members is also a crisis.
Yes, and I do know that there are First Nations who have declared states of emergency over the amount of suicides that happen, particularly with their youth in their communities.
Right, and that is, there's poverty, a sense of hopelessness, and what...
A lack of identity.
A lack of identity.
Right, and that feeling, so, and even
not
if
belonging.
Exactly, not belonging, feeling like nobody cares.
Right.
And it's really important for people to come from a place of love when we're hearing these reports, and in offering any assistance for the First Nation. I know it can seem like there's no bridge there between our communities, but they are there. There's organizations, whether you want to reach out to a friendship center, send a care package. I've done that previously.
Oh, okay.
And that might not be appropriate in the circumstance of suicide,
of course,
but in housing crisis or food crisis. But there are little things like that we can all do to help. But really, when it comes to if we're looking to prevent suicides in our youth, you know, getting mental health services are so important. And making those investments into that programming and ensuring that it's delivered. We need to do it.
We need to do it. And I Just Showed Up movement comes to me because when I say show up for yourself first, you have value and you matter. Everyone has value and they matter. Why? simply because they exist. There's no other criteria. Every single person has as much value and matters as much as everyone else. And for others, when you don't know what to do, you don't know what to say, just show up. Because those small acts of kindness, reaching out, saying, I care, you matter, and knowing that the truth is the truth and recognizing that, there are things that we can all do. Is there somewhere, if for people who want to make a difference, or where's the best place? Is there information, or what is the best place to find the right information or know a step that they can take? Is there somewhere?
One of the simplest and most fun ways, actually, that you can get involved if this is something that you're interested in. Attend a powwow.
Attend a powwow. I want to go to a powwow.
We have lots. We're surrounded by First Nation communities.
Okay.
So, I mean, go out to a powwow. It's a celebration. There's dancing. There is food. There is music. There is arts and crafts. My earrings.
I love your earrings. Are just beautiful. I would love earrings like this. Yes.
But that's a step
I love
towards
that.
building that bridge and getting to know the culture. We have our MCs at the powwows. They joke around and they'll tell you stories. They'll give you lessons about why we do things.
I love that.
It's a cultural experience.
Right.
You do learn a little bit more.
Well, I think that's a beautiful last thought, because, this is a lot of hard, difficult, it's such a challenging thing, but so let's create those bridges and have joyful celebrations together. So, and you'll love this, because I've spoken to you about Eva Olson, who is a Holocaust survivor. She just attended a powwow.
Oh, good. Is that her first one?
I'm not sure.
Not sure?
Well, knowing Eva, she's probably been to several, but she just said, I'm off to a powwow. Said, geez, I love you.
It's building relationships.
Building relationships. So, Trisha, thank you so much for being here, for sharing this important subject. We can all do our part as community members. We all have that responsibility. You do, I do, we all do. So thank you so much, and I will see you at a powwow.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thanks for joining us for Real Life Talks. This is a show about learning how to just show up for ourselves and just show up for others, and sometimes have very challenging conversations, but also knowing that we can make a difference. So if you want to be empowered and resilient and just show up, my call to action is always plan your life, plan your death, and then just love your life to death. And always bring your own tambourine to the party. Thanks.